Welcome back. Village life may seem quiet, but murder always finds its way in. In the frost-kissed heart of St. Mary's Mead, where the Winter Bazaar glittered with the promise of joy, a whisper slithered through the crowd, as insidious as the December chill. Miss Marple, his keen eyes gleaming beneath the brim of his hat, paused beside a stall of twinkling ornaments, his little gray cells already stirring. The villagers laughed and sang, their voices a merry chorus, yet Poirot sensed a discord, a shadow lurking beneath the festive glow. A woman's laughter rang too bright, a young man's smile strained too taut, a solicitor's glance darted too swiftly. "Mon Dieu," murmured Poirot, his moustache twitching. "There is a secret here, and where there is a secret, there is danger." Before the night was out, a scream would pierce the snow-laden air, and the twinkling lights would illuminate a crime that would challenge even the meticulous mind of Miss Marple. Chapter 1. The Bazaar's Glow. The village of St. Mary's Mead, nestled in the frosted folds of a December evening, shimmered with the gentle radiance of its annual Winter Bazaar. The town square, usually a modest crossroads of cobblestone and commerce, had transformed into a glittering tapestry of festive stalls, each draped with garlands of holly and twinkling fairy lights. The air carried the mingled scents of mulled wine, roasted chestnuts, and freshly cut pine, while the distant strains of a carol-singing choir floated like a soft hymn over the bustling crowd. It was a scene to warm the heart, yet Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively near the mulled wine stand, felt a faint prickle of unease beneath the merriment. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically in her lap, a gentle counterpoint to the lively chatter around her, but her sharp eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, missed nothing. Miss Marple, with her white hair neatly pinned and her shawl drawn snugly about her shoulders, was a familiar figure in St. Mary's Mead. To the casual observer, she was merely a kindly spinster, her days filled with knitting and village gossip. But those who knew her better, like her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who was even now weaving through the crowd with a purposeful stride, understood that Miss Marple's mind was as keen as her needles, capable of unraveling mysteries far knottier than any skein of wool. She had a way of noticing the small things, a glance held too long, a word spoken out of turn, a shadow where none should be. And tonight, as the bazaar glowed with festive cheer, Miss Marple sensed that something was amiss. The Winter Bazaar was the highlight of St. Mary's Mead's calendar, a tradition that drew villagers and visitors alike to celebrate the season and raise funds for local charities. This year, the event was underwritten by Mrs. Eliza Hawthorne, a widow of considerable wealth who lived in the grand Georgian manor on the edge of the village. Eliza, a tall woman with a commanding presence and a penchant for elegant furs, was both admired and whispered about. Her generosity was undeniable. She had funded new pews for the church, a library for the school, and now this splendid bazaar. But her private life was a subject of endless speculation. She had no children, only a nephew, Lionel Hawthorne, who lived with her at Hawthorne Manor and was widely assumed to be her heir. Yet, as Miss Marple sipped her mulled wine, her thoughts were drawn to the whispers she had overheard earlier that day, whispers that suggested all was not well between aunt and nephew. The gossip had begun at the vicarage tea, where Mrs. Bantry, ever the purveyor of village tidings, had leaned close to Miss Marple and murmured, "Have you heard, Jane? Eliza Hawthorne's been arguing with her solicitor, Mr. Percival Trent, about her will. They say she's planning to cut Lionel out entirely." Miss Marple had nodded thoughtfully, her needles never pausing. "Dear me," she had replied, "that would be most surprising. Lionel has always been devoted to his aunt, has he not?" Mrs. Bantry had pursed her lips. "Devoted, perhaps, but there's talk she's favoring someone else, a complete outsider. Clara Vane, that artist who moved here last summer. Can you imagine? Clara Vane was a newcomer to St. Mary's Mead, a painter of some repute who had taken up residence in a quaint cottage on Willow Lane. Her bohemian air, flowing scarves, vibrant colors, and an penchant for late-night sketching had made her a figure of curiosity, if not outright suspicion, among the villagers. Miss Marple had met her once at a garden party and found her charming, if somewhat guarded. The idea that Eliza Hawthorne might leave her fortune to Clara was intriguing, but Miss Marple was not one to leap to conclusions. Gossip, she knew, was like a poorly knitted scarf, full of holes and prone to unraveling. Now, as she sat at the bazaar, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the charity raffle stall where Lionel Hawthorne stood, his tall frame slightly stooped as he handed out tickets with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He was a handsome man in his early 30s, with dark hair and a scholarly air, though his manner tonight seemed strained. Miss Marple noted how his gaze flickered toward his aunt, who was holding court near the ice sculpture display, her laughter ringing out as she chatted with the vicar and several prominent villagers. Eliza's fur-trimmed coat gleamed under the fairy lights, and her voice carried a note of authority that commanded attention. Yet there was something in Lionel's expression, a tightness about the mouth, a shadow in the eyes, that suggested more than mere familial affection. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who settled onto the bench beside her with a rustle of taffeta and a conspiratorial smile. "Jane, you're missing all the excitement," she exclaimed, her cheeks flushed from the cold or perhaps the mulled wine. "Eliza's just announced a new prize for the raffle, a painting by Clara Vane, donated from her own collection. Everyone's talking about it. They say it's worth a small fortune." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. "How generous of Mrs. Hawthorne," she murmured. "And curious, too, that she should choose a painting by Miss Vane. One wonders what prompted such a choice." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's not all. I heard from Mrs. Price, who heard it from the postmistress, that Eliza and Lionel had a dreadful row this morning at the manor. Something about the will, and Lionel stormed out, saying he'd never forgive her. Can you believe it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Gossip is a slippery thing, Dolly," she said softly. "But I do wonder what stirred such a change in Mrs. Hawthorne's plans. People do not alter their wills lightly, you know." As Mrs. Bantry prattled on about the village's latest speculations, Miss Marple's attention shifted to the crowd. She noticed Mr. Percival Trent, Eliza's solicitor, standing near the roasted chestnut stall, his thin face pale and his hands fidgeting with a pocket watch. Trent was a man of meticulous habits, known for his discretion, but tonight he seemed ill at ease, his eyes darting toward Eliza and then away. Miss Marple made a mental note of his discomfort, filing it away with the precision of a librarian cataloging a book. Nearby, Clara Vane moved through the crowd, her scarlet scarf trailing like a banner. She paused to admire a stall selling handmade ornaments, her fingers brushing the delicate glass baubles with an artist's appreciation. Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes scanned the crowd, as if searching for someone or avoiding them. There was something about Clara that reminded Miss Marple of a young woman she had known in her youth, a girl who had carried a secret like a heavy shawl, visible only in the way she moved. The evening wore on, and the bazaar grew livelier. Children darted between stalls, clutching toffee apples, while couples strolled arm in arm, their laughter mingling with the clink of coins and the rustle of paper bags. The choir launched into a spirited rendition of Good King Wenceslas, and the crowd joined in, their voices rising into the frosty air. Miss Marple, however, remained alert, her senses attuned to the undercurrents beneath the festive surface. She noticed Mrs. Agnes Reed, the constable's wife and Eliza's former housekeeper, lingering near the mulled wine stand, her face drawn and her eyes fixed on Eliza with an intensity that bordered on resentment. Agnes had served at Hawthorne Manor for years before her marriage, and though she was now a respectable matron, there was a hardness in her gaze that Miss Marple found intriguing. As the clock in the town square chimed 9, Eliza Hawthorne stepped onto a small platform to address the crowd. Her voice, clear and commanding, carried over the murmurs. "My dear friends," she began, "I am delighted to welcome you to this year's Winter Bazaar. Your generosity tonight will support our village's charities, and I am proud to announce a special addition to the raffle, a magnificent painting by our own Clara Vane, a true gem for any collector." The crowd applauded, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Lionel, who stood at the edge of the platform, his hands clenched at his sides. Clara, standing nearby, flushed at the mention of her name, her scarf slipping slightly to reveal a delicate locket at her throat. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A locket, she thought, was often more than a mere ornament. It could hold a photograph, a lock of hair, a secret. Mrs. Bantry nudged Miss Marple. "Look at Lionel," she whispered. "He's positively green. Do you think he knows about the will?" Miss Marple did not reply immediately, her mind sifting through the fragments of information she had gathered. Lionel's tension, Eliza's sudden generosity toward Clara, Trent's unease, Agnes's resentment. These were threads in a tapestry that was only beginning to take shape. "People are rarely what they seem, Dolly," she said at last, "and a bazaar, with all its lights and noise, is the perfect place to hide a truth in plain sight." The choir struck up another carol, and the crowd surged toward the stalls, eager to spend their shillings. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with the steady rhythm of her thoughts. She recalled a similar bazaar years ago in her youth, when a seemingly trivial quarrel had led to a theft that unraveled a family's secrets. People, she knew, were creatures of habit, and their habits, whether a nervous glance or a carefully chosen word, often betrayed them. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple's observations grew sharper. She noticed how Lionel avoided his aunt's gaze, choosing instead to focus on the raffle tickets, his smile growing more strained with each passing hour. She saw Clara pause near the ice sculpture display, her fingers lingering on the cold surface as if tracing a memory. And she noted Mr. Trent's repeated glances at his watch, as if time itself were a burden he could not shake. The bazaar was nearing its peak when a sudden commotion drew Miss Marple's attention. A young boy, no more than 10, ran through the crowd, shouting that he had lost his mother's purse near the chestnut stall. The villagers rallied to help, their voices rising in a chorus of concern. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her eyes fixed on the scene. She noticed Agnes Reed slip away from the mulled wine stand, her movements swift and purposeful, as if she had seen an opportunity in the chaos. Miss Marple made another mental note, her mind weaving connections like the stitches in her scarf. Mrs. Bantry returned, her arms laden with purchases, a jar of homemade jam, a knitted tea cozy, and a small wooden carving. "Jane, you must come see the ice sculptures," she exclaimed. "They're simply marvelous this year, a swan, a castle, even a Christmas tree." Miss Marple smiled. "In a moment, Dolly. I find the crowd itself more illuminating than any sculpture." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You and your people watching. I swear, Jane, you could find a mystery in a cup of tea." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. "But it is often in the ordinary moments that the extraordinary reveals itself." As the night deepened, the air grew colder, and the crowd began to thin. The choir sang its final carol, and the stalls started to pack up, their wares dwindling as the villagers headed home. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her knitting nearly complete. She watched as Eliza Hawthorne bid farewell to the vicar, her laughter bright, but her posture weary, as if the weight of her wealth or her secrets pressed upon her. Lionel, too, was preparing to leave, his raffle stall now empty, his face a mask of exhaustion. Clara Vane approached Eliza, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. The two women exchanged a few words, too quiet for Miss Marple to hear, but she noted the intensity of their exchange, the way Clara's hand briefly touched Eliza's arm. There was a familiarity there, a connection that went beyond mere acquaintance. Miss Marple filed this observation away, her mind already spinning a thread of possibility. Mr. Trent, meanwhile, had disappeared into the crowd, his pocket watch no longer in sight. Miss Marple wondered what had prompted his haste, what appointment he might be keeping, or avoiding. And Agnes Reed, now back at the mulled wine stand, was serving the last of the patrons with a smile that seemed forced, her eyes darting toward the ice sculpture display where Eliza and Clara stood. The clock struck 10, and the bazaar's glow began to fade, the fairy lights dimming as the stalls closed. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, her shawl snug against the chill. She had seen enough to know that the Winter Bazaar, for all its cheer, was a stage for something darker. The whispers about Eliza's will, the tension in Lionel's smile, the unease in Trent's demeanor, the resentment in Agnes's gaze, the mystery of Clara's locket, these were clues, small but significant, in a puzzle that was only beginning to form. As she made her way home, the snow crunching softly under her boots, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of secrets. They were like the ice sculptures at the bazaar, beautiful, fleeting, and destined to melt under scrutiny. And she, with her quiet ways and her sharp mind, was determined to see what lay beneath. "Jane, you've heard, haven't you?" Mrs. Bantry had whispered earlier, her eyes wide with excitement. "Eliza's cutting Lionel out entirely. They say she's giving it all to that artist, Clara Vane." Miss Marple's needles had clicked steadily, her expression serene. "Gossip is a slippery thing, Dolly. But I do wonder what stirred such a change." Mrs. Bantry had leaned closer, undeterred. "It's scandalous, Jane. Lionel's devoted his life to her, and now this? I heard he was furious, shouting at her in the Manor's drawing-room." Miss Marple had tilted her head, her voice soft. "Anger is a common response to disappointment, Dolly. But it is rarely the whole story. The rumor about Clara Vane, with her bohemian charm and mysterious past, suggested a romantic or manipulative hold over Eliza, but Miss Marple doubted its simplicity. The truth, she suspected, was woven from finer threads, threads she would carefully unravel in the days to come. Chapter 2. A Chilling Discovery. The Winter Bazaar of St. Mary's Mead, so recently alive with laughter and light, had settled into a quieter rhythm as the clock neared 11. The last strains of carols faded, replaced by the soft crunch of snow underfoot as villagers began their homeward journeys. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked into her basket, lingered near the mulled wine stand, her eyes scanning the thinning crowd. The festive glow of the bazaar had not entirely dispelled the unease she felt, a sense that the evening's harmony was but a fragile veneer. Her instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, told her that the whispers about Eliza Hawthorne's will were more than mere gossip. They were the prelude to something darker. The air was sharp with frost, and Miss Marple drew her shawl closer, her breath forming small clouds in the night. She had just decided to make her way home when a piercing scream shattered the stillness, slicing through the murmurs of departing villagers like a knife through silk. The sound came from the direction of the ice sculpture display, where a cluster of swan and castle carvings gleamed under the fairy lights. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear but with the calm alertness of one accustomed to sudden disruptions. She moved swiftly toward the commotion, her small, neat steps belying her age, her eyes already searching for the source of the disturbance. A crowd had gathered near the largest sculpture, a magnificent swan that shimmered with an almost ethereal beauty. At its base, sprawled in the snow, lay Mrs. Eliza Hawthorne, her fur-trimmed coat splayed like dark wings against the white ground. A silver letter opener, its handle intricately engraved, protruded from her chest, a stark and terrible ornament. The snow around her was stained crimson, a vivid contrast to the pristine drifts beyond. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some stepping back in horror, others craning forward with morbid curiosity. Miss Marple, edging closer, took in the scene with her characteristic precision. Eliza's face, so recently animated with laughter, was now still, her eyes wide and unseeing. The letter opener's handle bore the initials L.H. in elegant script, a detail that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. She glanced at Lionel Hawthorne, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face ashen, his hands trembling. The villagers' whispers grew louder, their eyes darting between Lionel and the damning initials on the weapon. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Eliza, his fingers searching for a pulse, though his grim expression suggested he expected none. After a moment he looked up at Constable Reed, who had arrived with a lantern, his face pale but resolute. "She's gone, Doctor," Haydock said quietly. "Stabbed through the heart. Death would have been near instantaneous." Constable Reed, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air, nodded and turned to the crowd. "Step back, please," he called, his voice firm despite the tremor in it. "This is a crime scene now. No one leaves until we've sorted this out." His eyes fell on Lionel, and his expression hardened. "Mr. Hawthorne, you'll need to come with me." Lionel's head jerked up, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Me? You can't think I didn't do this. I was at the raffle stall all evening." His protest was drowned by the murmurs of the crowd, some nodding sympathetically, others whispering accusations. The initials on the letter opener were a heavy weight, and Miss Marple could see the suspicion settling over Lionel like a shroud. She stepped closer, her voice gentle but clear. "Constable, might I have a look before you move anything? It may be helpful to note the details." Constable Reed hesitated, then nodded. He respected Miss Marple's reputation for insight, though he sometimes found her interference exasperating. "Just be quick, Miss Marple," he said. "We need to preserve the scene." Miss Marple knelt carefully, her eyes scanning the ground around Eliza's body. The letter opener was indeed finely crafted, its silver handle etched with a floral pattern that spoke of expense and taste. Hardly the sort of thing Lionel, with his modest habits, would own. She noted the angle of the blade, suggesting a forceful thrust, and the lack of defensive wounds on Eliza's hands, which implied she had been taken by surprise. Her gaze moved to the snow, where footprints crisscrossed in a chaotic dance, most blurred by the crowd's trampling. But one detail caught her eye, a small piece of scarlet fabric, torn and caught on the edge of the swan sculpture's base. It reminded her of the scarf Clara Vane had worn that evening. Rising, Miss Marple glanced toward the crowd and saw Clara herself slipping away, her movements swift and almost furtive. The scarlet scarf was still about her neck, but it appeared shorter, as if a piece had been torn free. Miss Marple's mind registered this, along with the fact that Clara's departure coincided with the arrival of the constable. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple was not one to trust coincidences. Mrs. Bantry, who had joined the onlookers, clutched Miss Marple's arm, her face pale. "Jane, it's dreadful." "Poor Eliza. And Lionel, those initials. Do you think he could have done it?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her eyes thoughtful. "Initials are a curious thing, Dolly," she said softly. "They tell a story, but not always the true one. This letter opener is far too fine for Lionel's tastes, don't you think? And yet it appears so conveniently to point to him." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You mean it might be a plant?" "Oh, Jane, you're always seeing things no one else does." Miss Marple did not reply, her attention drawn to Mr. Percival Trent, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his thin face paler than usual. He was mopping his brow with a handkerchief, despite the cold, and his eyes darted nervously toward Lionel, then away. "Mr. Trent seems most distressed," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "I wonder why." Constable Reed, meanwhile, had taken Lionel by the arm, leading him toward the village hall, which served as a makeshift station. "We'll need a statement, Mr. Hawthorne," he said gruffly, "and an explanation for that letter opener." "I tell you it's not mine," Lionel protested, his voice breaking. "I was at the raffle stall. I didn't even see Aunt Eliza after our talk earlier." Miss Marple noted the word talk, her mind filing it away. She recalled the gossip about Lionel and Eliza's argument that morning, a detail Mrs. Bantry had shared with such relish. Had their disagreement escalated to this tragic end, or was there another hand at work, guiding the blade and the blame? As the crowd dispersed, urged along by Constable Reed's deputy, Miss Marple lingered near the crime scene, her eyes sweeping the area once more. She noticed a discarded cigarette butt in the snow, its tip stained with red lipstick, a shade she recognized as belonging to Mrs. Agnes Reed, the constable's wife and Eliza's former housekeeper. Agnes had been at the mulled wine stand earlier, her gaze fixed on Eliza with an intensity that had struck Miss Marple as significant. The cigarette was a small clue, but in Miss Marple's experience, small clues often led to large truths. Dr. Haydock approached, his face weary. "A bad business, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. Eliza was a strong woman, but even she couldn't survive a wound like that. Whoever did this meant business. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Doctor." And they chose a moment when the bazaar was at its busiest, ensuring confusion. A bold move or a desperate one? The doctor raised an eyebrow. "You're already thinking it's more than it seems, aren't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am only observing, Doctor. But I find it curious how such a personal item as a letter opener appears so conveniently to implicate one person." Dr. Haydock sighed. "Well, I'll leave the sleuthing to you. I've got to prepare a report for the coroner." He tipped his hat and moved off, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She turned her attention to the ice sculptures, their surfaces catching the last flickers of the fairy lights. The swan, majestic even in tragedy, seemed to guard its secrets as closely as Eliza had guarded hers. Miss Marple's mind returned to the whispers about the will, the tension between Eliza and Lionel, the mysterious Clara Vane, and the uneasy Mr. Trent. And then there was Agnes Reed, whose resentment had been palpable, and whose cigarette now lay in the snow like a silent accusation. As she made her way toward the village hall, where Lionel was being questioned, Miss Marple reflected on a case from her youth, when a similar act of violence had been cloaked in misdirection. A stolen brooch, a planted letter, a false witness. People, she knew, were adept at weaving webs to hide their truths. But webs, no matter how intricate, could be unraveled with patience and care. "Lionel's no killer," Mr. Trent said, mopping his brow as he joined Miss Marple near the crime scene. "But that letter opener, it's damning." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice mild. "Curious, isn't it, Mr. Trent, how such a personal item appears so conveniently? One might almost think it was placed there to be found." Trent's eyes flickered with unease. "You don't think someone framed him?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that we must look beyond what is obvious. The obvious is rarely the truth. The letter opener's initials pointed squarely at Lionel, but its craftsmanship suggested it belonged to someone with finer tastes, perhaps someone who knew its discovery would cast suspicion on the young heir. Chapter 3. The Suspects Emerge. The morning after the tragedy at the Winter Bazaar, St. Mary's Mead awoke to a village cloaked in both frost and suspicion. The news of Mrs. Eliza Hawthorne's murder had spread like wildfire, fanned by whispers of the silver letter opener and its damning initials, L.H. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cozy parlor with a pot of tea and her knitting, pondered the events of the previous night. Her cottage, with its neatly tended garden and lace-curtained windows, was a haven of tranquility, yet her mind was anything but still. The murder of Eliza Hawthorne was a puzzle, and Miss Marple was already piecing together its fragments, each clue a stitch in a complex pattern. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever eager to share the latest village tidings, arrived shortly after breakfast, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her eyes alight with purpose. "Jane, you must come with me to Hawthorne Manor," she insisted, settling into an armchair with a rustle of her winter coat. "They're all in a state, and I've told them you'll offer your condolences. But really, it's the perfect chance to observe. Everyone's talking about Lionel, but I'm not so sure he did it." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression serene. "It is kind of you to think of me, Dolly," she said, "but I wonder if condolences are all you have in mind." "You've always had a nose for intrigue," Mrs. Bantry laughed, unabashed. "Well, perhaps. But you're the one who sees things, Jane. I swear you could spot a secret in a vicar's sermon." Miss Marple smiled faintly and set her knitting aside. "Very well, Dolly. Let us pay our respects and perhaps learn a little more about poor Mrs. Hawthorne's circle, Hawthorne Manor. A grand Georgian pile on the edge of the village stood sombre under a sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Its tall windows reflected the gray light, and the air of morning was palpable as Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry were shown into the drawing-room by a subdued maid. The room was elegantly appointed, with polished mahogany furniture and portraits of stern-faced Hawthornes gazing down from the walls. Yet the atmosphere was thick with tension, as if the very air held its breath. Lionel Hawthorne was there, released on bail, pending further investigation, his face pale and his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, as if to steady himself against the weight of suspicion. Clara Vane sat near a window, her scarlet scarf draped over her shoulders, her fingers fidgeting with a sketchbook that lay unopened in her lap. Mr. Percival Trent, Eliza's solicitor, hovered near a sideboard, his thin frame taut with nervous energy, as he poured himself a glass of water, with hands that trembled slightly. And Mrs. Agnes Reed, the constable's wife and Eliza's former housekeeper, sat stiffly on a sofa, her face composed, but her eyes darting about the room as if searching for an escape. Mrs. Bantry, ever the gracious guest, offered her condolences with practiced ease, her words filling the awkward silence. "Such a dreadful loss," she said, addressing the room at large. "Eliza was the heart of the bazaar and of so much in the village. We shall all feel her absence keenly." Lionel nodded, his voice low. "Thank you, Mrs. Bantry. It's all so unreal. I keep expecting her to walk through the door, scolding me for some trifling thing." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, observed the group with her usual acuity. Lionel's grief seemed genuine, but there was a brittleness to it, as if he feared more than the loss of his aunt. Clara's nervous glances suggested she was hiding something, though whether it was guilt or merely discomfort in the face of tragedy, Miss Marple could not yet say. Mr. Trent's agitation was unmistakable, his fingers repeatedly touching the pocket where his watch usually resided, though it was absent today. And Agnes Reed, despite her composed demeanor, had a hardness in her eyes that spoke of old grievances. The conversation turned to the bazaar, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity to probe gently. "Mrs. Hawthorne was so generous with the raffle prize," she said, her voice mild. "A painting by Miss Vane, I believe." "It must have been a special connection between you, Miss Vane, to inspire such a gesture." Clara flushed, her fingers tightening on her sketchbook. "Mrs. Hawthorne was a patron of the arts," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "She bought one of my paintings last month, a landscape. She said it reminded her of her childhood. I was honored to donate another for the bazaar." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the way Clara's gaze flickered toward Lionel, who looked away. "A lovely gesture," she said, "and I understand Mrs. Hawthorne was planning to support a charity for artists. Mr. Trent, you must know more about her plans, being her solicitor." Trent's glass clinked against the sideboard as he set it down too quickly. "Yes, well," he stammered. "Eliza was considering several charitable bequests. She was very particular about her legacy, but I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, you understand?" "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, but her mind alert. Trent's reluctance suggested there was more to the will than he cared to admit, and his nervousness hinted at a personal stake in the matter. She recalled the whispers about Eliza's intention to disinherit Lionel, and wondered if Trent's unease stemmed from knowledge of that decision, or something else entirely. Agnes Reed spoke up, her voice clipped. "Mrs. Hawthorne was always generous, but she could be secretive. She'd lock herself in her study for hours, writing letters. I used to tidy that room when I worked here, and I'd see her at it, scribbling away." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Letters, you say, Mrs. Reed? Did she post them herself, or did someone assist her?" Agnes hesitated, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "She gave them to Miss Vane, mostly. I saw her hand over a bundle just last week." Clara's head snapped up, her cheeks coloring. "They were just notes about the painting," she said quickly. "Nothing important." Miss Marple smiled gently, but her mind was racing. Letters entrusted to Clara suggested a deeper connection between her and Eliza, one that might explain the rumors about the will, and Agnes's tone, edged with resentment, hinted at a history of friction. Miss Marple recalled a woman from her youth, a housekeeper who had harbored a grudge against her employer for years, her quiet bitterness erupting in unexpected ways. People, she knew, could nurture their grievances like a gardener tends a prized rose until they bloomed into something dangerous. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the tension, steered the conversation to safer ground, chattering about the bazaar's success despite its tragic end. But Miss Marple's attention remained on the group, noting their interactions. Lionel avoided Clara's gaze, his jaw tight. Clara's fingers traced the edge of her sketchbook as if seeking comfort in its familiar texture. Trent's eyes darted toward the door as if he longed to escape, and Agnes, though silent now, watched Clara with a scrutiny that bordered on hostility. As the visit drew to a close, Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "Thank you for receiving us," she said, addressing Lionel. "I am sure the truth about your aunt's death will come to light. The village will not rest until it does." Lionel's eyes met hers, a flicker of gratitude in their depths. "I hope so, Miss Marple." I didn't do this. I swear it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind, but inscrutable. "I believe you mean that, Mr. Hawthorne, and I believe the truth has a way of revealing itself, given time." As she and Mrs. Bantry made their way back to the village, the snow falling softly around them, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects she had observed. Lionel, burdened by suspicion, Clara, nervous and evasive, Trent, hiding something behind his solicitor's reserve, and Agnes, whose quiet resentment suggested a deeper wound. Each was a thread in the tapestry of Eliza's death, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to their source. Mrs. Bantry, bundled in her coat, broke the silence. "Well, Jane, what did you make of that? Lionel's a wreck, Clara's jumpy as a cat, and Mr. Trent looked like he'd seen a ghost. And Agnes, did you see how she glared at Clara?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "I saw, Dolly. And I saw more than that. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways. A glance, a pause, a choice of words. We have only begun to unravel this mystery." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "You're impossible, Jane. I suppose you've already got a theory?" "Not a theory," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Merely observations." "But observations, Dolly, are the foundation of truth." "Eliza was secretive lately," Agnes confided, her voice low as she polished a vase in the drawing-room. "She'd lock herself in her study, writing letters." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes keen. "Letters, you say? Did she post them herself?" Agnes hesitated, her cloth pausing. "No, she gave them to Clara." Clara's voice cut in, sharp with defensiveness. "They were about the painting, nothing more." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Of course, Miss Vane. But it is curious how small details can take on such significance, is it not? The letters suggested a hidden correspondence, possibly blackmail or a clandestine arrangement, but their contents remained elusive, pointing suspicion toward Clara while leaving the true nature of her relationship with Eliza unclear. Chapter 4. A Trail of Clues. The pale light of a winter morning filtered through the frost-etched windows of St. Mary's Mead, casting a delicate shimmer over the village square where the remnants of the Winter Bazaar stood in silent disarray. The festive stalls, stripped of their garlands, looked forlorn under a fresh dusting of snow, and the ice sculptures, though still magnificent, seemed to mourn the tragedy that had unfolded in their shadow. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, made her way to the scene of Eliza Hawthorne's murder, her steps measured but purposeful. The constable had cordoned off the area around the swan sculpture, but Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and a quiet word to Constable Reed's deputy, was permitted to approach. She had no official authority, of course, but her reputation for insight granted her a certain latitude in village matters. The air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the lingering tang of mulled wine from the previous night. Miss Marple's eyes, keen behind her spectacles, swept over the crime scene with the precision of a seamstress inspecting a delicate stitch. The snow around the swan sculpture was trampled, a chaotic map of footprints that told her little except that the crowd had been quick to gather after Eliza's body was discovered. The blood stain, now frozen into a dark, crystalline patch, marked the spot where Eliza had fallen, and Miss Marple noted its position relative to the sculpture's base. The letter opener, with its incriminating initials L.H., had been removed by the constable for evidence, but its image was fixed in her mind. its silver handle too ornate for Lionel Hawthorne's modest tastes, too conveniently placed to be unquestioned. As she circled the sculpture, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small, vivid detail, a torn piece of scarlet fabric, no larger than a child's handkerchief, caught on a jagged edge of the ice swan's pedestal. She bent closer, careful not to disturb it, and recognized it as a match for the scarf Clara Vane had worn the previous evening. The tear was ragged, suggesting it had been caught in haste, perhaps as Clara fled the scene, or as someone wished it to appear. Miss Marple straightened, her mind turning over the possibilities. Clara's nervous demeanor at Hawthorne Manor that morning, her quick denial of the letter's significance, and now this scrap of fabric, all pointed to her involvement. Yet Miss Marple sensed a deeper layer to the puzzle. A planted clue was as telling as a genuine one, and she had seen such misdirection before, in a case involving a stolen necklace where a torn glove had led the village to suspect the wrong culprit. Moving a few steps away, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to another detail, a cigarette butt half buried in the snow near the bloodstain. Its tip bore the unmistakable smear of red lipstick, a shade she had seen on Mrs. Agnes Reed at the bazaar. Agnes, with her quiet resentment and her history as Eliza's housekeeper, had been at the mulled wine stand, her eyes fixed on her former employer with an intensity that had not escaped Miss Marple's notice. The cigarette was a small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple knew that small things often held great significance. She recalled a village scandal years ago when a discarded matchstick had revealed a secret rendezvous, unraveling a web of deceit. She made a mental note to speak with Agnes, though she suspected the woman would guard her secrets as fiercely as she polished the manor's silver. As she continued her inspection, Miss Marple noticed a crumpled piece of paper, half hidden beneath a drift of snow near the sculpture's base. She retrieved it carefully, smoothing it out with gloved fingers. It was a note in Eliza Hawthorne's elegant handwriting, the ink smudged but legible. "Meet me at midnight. We must settle this." The words were cryptic, their urgency underscored by the hurried script. Miss Marple tucked the note into her pocket, glancing around to ensure no one had seen. The note suggested a clandestine meeting, but with whom? And what matter was so pressing that it required a midnight rendezvous at the bazaar? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who bustled toward her, her coat dusted with snow, and her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, what on earth are you doing out here in the cold?" she exclaimed. "Have you found something?" "Everyone's talking about Lionel's arrest, but I heard he's been released on bail. Do you think he's innocent?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but non-committal. "I think, Dolly, that we must look beyond the obvious. This note, for instance," she patted her pocket lightly, "suggests Mrs. Hawthorne had an appointment last night, one she felt was urgent. But with whom and why?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "A secret meeting? Oh, Jane, you don't think it was Lionel, do you? Or perhaps Clara Vane? She was acting so strangely at the manor this morning." Miss Marple did not reply immediately, her mind sifting through the clues. The note, the scarf, the cigarette, all were threads in a tapestry that was still taking shape. She decided to visit Lionel Hawthorne, who was staying at the village inn while the manor was under scrutiny. The inn, A cozy establishment with low beams and a crackling fire was abuzz with villagers discussing the murder, their voices hushed but eager. Lionel sat alone in a corner, his face drawn, a glass of untouched brandy before him. Miss Marple approached, her demeanor kind but probing. "Mr. Hawthorne, I am so sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Might I have a word?" "I understand you spoke with your aunt last evening before the tragedy." Lionel looked up, his eyes weary but wary. "Yes, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "We talked around 9 near the raffle stall. She was upset about something, wouldn't say what. I tried to reason with her, but she brushed me off, said she had to meet someone later. I left her there, alive and well. I swear it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the sincerity in his tone, but also the slight hesitation, as if he were choosing his words with care. "And this meeting," she said, "did she mention who it was with?" Lionel shook his head. "No, she was vague, said it was private. I thought it might be about the will. She'd been talking about changes for weeks. I didn't press her. I wish I had. Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic, but her mind was alert. Lionel's account aligned with the note, but his omission of their earlier argument, as reported by Mrs. Bantry, suggested he was not telling the whole truth. She thanked him and moved on, her next stop, Clara Vane's cottage on Willow Lane. Clara's cottage was a charming, if cluttered space filled with canvases, paintbrushes, and the faint smell of turpentine. Clara herself was pale, her scarlet scarf draped over a chair, its torn edge now evident. She greeted Miss Marple with a nervous smile, offering tea with hands that trembled slightly. "I was sorry to hear about Mrs. Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "You were close, I understand, with your painting in her collection and the letters she entrusted to you." Clara's eyes flickered with unease. "We weren't close, exactly," she said quickly. "She liked my work, that's all." The letters were about the painting, arrangements for its delivery. "I was in my studio all night, working on a new piece. I didn't see anything at the bazaar." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze steady. "A new piece at midnight? How dedicated you are, Miss Vane. And yet a piece of your scarf was found near the crime scene. Curious, is it not?" Clara's cup clattered against its saucer. "My scarf? That's impossible. I must have dropped it earlier. I was at the bazaar, yes, but I left before it happened." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Clara's denial was swift, but her nervousness betrayed a deeper concern. The torn scarf, the midnight alibi, the letters, all suggested Clara was entangled in the mystery, but whether as culprit or pawn, Miss Marple could not yet determine. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the clues she had gathered. The note pointed to a secret meeting, the scarf implicated Clara, and the cigarette hinted at Agnes's presence. Each clue was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was far from complete. She recalled a case from her youth when a misplaced glove had led to a false accusation, only for the true culprit to be revealed by a single overlooked detail. Patience, she knew, was the key to unraveling such webs. "I saw nothing, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice trembling as she poured tea. "I was working on a portrait in my studio." All night Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her tone gentle but probing. "A portrait at midnight? How dedicated, Miss Vane! And yet a piece of your scarf was found near poor Mrs. Hawthorne. One wonders how it came to be there." Clara's face paled, her hands gripping the teapot. I don't know. It must have been an accident." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Accidents, my dear, are often more revealing than intentions." The note's vague wording, "Meet me at midnight. We must settle this," implied a clandestine meeting, possibly with Lionel or Clara, but its ambiguity could point to anyone, diverting attention from the true circumstances of Eliza's death. Chapter 5. The Will's Shadow. The afternoon sun, pale and watery, slanted through the tall windows of Hawthorne Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors and antique rugs. The house, usually a bastion of quiet elegance, now hummed with an undercurrent of unease, as if the very walls had absorbed the shock of Eliza Hawthorne's murder and were whispering it back to those within. Miss Jane Marple, invited once more by Mrs. Dolly Bantry under the guise of offering further condolences, sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm. Her eyes, however, were far from idle, darting from face to face as the key figures in the tragedy assembled for the reading of Eliza's will. It was a gathering fraught with anticipation, and Miss Marple sensed that the revelations to come would illuminate not only the distribution of Eliza's fortune, but also the motives that might have led to her untimely death. Mr. Percival Trent, Eliza's solicitor, stood at the head of the room, a sheaf of papers in his hand, and his thin face set in lines of professional gravity. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing slightly in the tense silence, and began to read the document with a voice that, despite his efforts, betrayed a hint of tremor. The will was dated only a week prior, a detail that Miss Marple noted with interest, for it suggested a recent and perhaps hasty change in Eliza's intentions. As Trent proceeded through the preliminary clauses, the room's occupants shifted uncomfortably. Lionel Hawthorne, his face pale and his hands clenched in his lap. Clara Vane, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarlet scarf, which had been mended since the bazaar. Mrs. Agnes Reed, seated stiffly with her eyes fixed on the floor, and Mrs. Bantry, who glanced at Miss Marple with wide-eyed curiosity. The bequests began modestly, sums to the church, the village school, and various charities that Eliza had supported in life. Then Trent reached the heart of the matter. "To my nephew, Lionel Hawthorne," he read, "I leave the sum of £5,000 in recognition of his companionship over the years." Lionel's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a mixture of shock and anger, but he said nothing. Miss Marple observed his reaction closely, recalling the rumors of his expected inheritance of the entire estate. This paltry sum was a blow, and it raised questions about what had transpired between aunt and nephew to prompt such a drastic alteration. Trent continued, his voice steadying as he read on. "The remainder of my estate, including Hawthorne Manor, my investments, and all personal effects, I leave to the establishment of a charity for displaced artists, to be administered by Miss Clara Vane as its trustee. This charity shall provide support and residencies for artists in need, in memory of those who have struggled, as I once did." A gasp rippled through the room. Clara's face flushed crimson, her eyes widening in what appeared to be genuine surprise. Lionel leaped to his feet, his voice sharp with fury. "This is outrageous. Aunt Eliza promised me the estate. She said it would be mine. This must be a mistake. Trent adjusted his spectacles, his expression one of discomfort. I assure you, Mr. Hawthorne, the will is valid and duly witnessed. It was drafted at Mrs. Hawthorne's explicit instructions, and she was of sound mind when she signed it. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she absorbed this revelation. The charity for displaced artists was an unexpected turn, and Clara's role as trustee placed her at the center of the fortune's distribution. It suggested a deep trust between Eliza and Clara, one that went beyond mere patronage of art. Miss Marple wondered about the nature of that trust. Had Eliza seen in Clara a kindred spirit, or was there something more personal at play? And Lionel's outrage, while understandable, hinted at a desperation that could have fueled darker impulses. As the reading concluded, the room erupted into murmured conversations. Lionel paced the floor, his hands running through his hair in agitation. She changed it a week ago. Why? What happened to make her do this? He turned to Clara, his eyes accusing. You must have influenced her, twisted her mind against me. Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. I had no idea, Lionel. Mrs. Hawthorne never mentioned this to me. I'm as shocked as you are, Miss Marple intervened gently, her voice cutting through the tension. Mr. Trent, might I ask when exactly the will was drafted? A week ago, you say, but on what date precisely? Trent hesitated, his fingers fumbling with the papers. It was last Tuesday the 10th. Mrs. Hawthorne came to my office in the morning, insistent on the changes. She seemed determined, almost urgent. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting Trent's unease, the way his eyes avoided hers, the slight quiver in his hand. Urgency suggested a catalyst, perhaps a recent discovery or confrontation that had prompted Eliza to alter her legacy so dramatically. She recalled a similar situation in her youth, when a wealthy widow had rewritten her will after uncovering a family secret, only for tragedy to follow. People, she knew, acted swiftly when threatened, and Eliza's haste might point to the very motive behind her murder. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain her gossip-loving nature, leaned toward Miss Marple and whispered, Did you hear about Clara's past, Jane? I had it from Mrs. Price, who knows a woman in London. There was a scandal years ago, something about a forged painting. Clara was involved, they say, though nothing was proven. Perhaps Eliza found out and was using it to her advantage. Or maybe Clara silenced her to keep it secret. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Gossip is a double-edged sword, Dolly, she murmured. It can cut through to the truth or lead us astray. But it is worth considering what Mrs. Hawthorne might have known about Miss Vane's history. The group dispersed gradually, Lionel storming off to his room, Clara excusing herself with a murmur about needing air, and Agnes Reed slipping away quietly, her face inscrutable. Trent gathered his papers, his movements hurried, as if eager to escape the Manor's oppressive atmosphere. Miss Marple approached him, her demeanor unassuming, but her questions pointed. Mr. Trent, you must have known Mrs. Hawthorne well, handling her affairs as you did. Did she mention any concerns that might have prompted this change? Trent's face tightened, his voice stiff. She trusted Clara implicitly. The charity was her passion. She spoke of it often in our meetings. It was meant to help artists like Clara, who have faced hardships. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Passion can blind us, Mr. Trent, or it can sharpen our focus. One wonders if Mrs. Hawthorne's passion was purely altruistic, or if there was a personal element involved. Trent's eyes flickered with something, discomfort, perhaps, or fear, and he excused himself abruptly, claiming another appointment. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning over his words. Trust in Clara, passion for the charity. These were pieces of the puzzle, but they did not yet fit neatly. The forged painting scandal, if true, could explain Clara's nervousness, suggesting she had something to hide. But was it enough to drive her to murder? Or was the will itself a red herring, diverting attention from another motive? Mrs. Bantry, lingering by the fireplace, chattered on about the village's reactions to the murder. Everyone saying Lionel did it for the inheritance, but now with this will he had no reason, unless he didn't know about the change. "Oh, Jane, it's all so confusing," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Confusion is the murderer's ally, Dolly. But clarity comes with observation. Notice how Mr. Trent avoided my question about Eliza's concerns, and Clara's surprise seemed genuine, yet her role as trustee gives her control over a fortune. Lionel's fury is understandable, but fury alone does not make a killer." As they prepared to leave the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Agnes Reed, who had been unusually silent during the reading. Agnes's history as Eliza's housekeeper meant she knew the household secrets, and her resentment, evident in her gaze, suggested old wounds. Had she known about the will's change? Or was she harboring a grudge that the charity's establishment had exacerbated? The drive back to the village was quiet, the snow-covered lanes muffling the sound of the car's tires. Miss Marple's mind was active, weaving the threads of the day's revelations. The will's shadow loomed large, casting doubt on motives and relationships. Eliza's decision to favor the charity over her nephew pointed to a rift, perhaps deepened by recent events. Clara's past scandal added a layer of intrigue, suggesting blackmail or exposure as possible motives. Trent's unease hinted at knowledge he was reluctant to share, and Lionel's anger could be the spark that ignited violence. Miss Marple recalled a case from her days in St. Mary Mead, when a changed will had led to a poisoning, the culprit revealed by a misplaced letter. Here, too, letters had been mentioned, Agnes's confession that Eliza gave them to Clara. Perhaps those letters held the key, revealing the true nature of Eliza's relationships and the secrets that had led to her death. Upon returning home, Miss Marple settled into her parlor, her knitting resuming its steady click. The will was a pivotal clue, but it was only one piece. The shadow it cast was long, obscuring the truth, but Miss Marple was patient. She would continue to observe, to question, to unravel the threads until the pattern emerged clear and undeniable. "Eliza trusted Clara," Trent said stiffly as he packed his briefcase. "The charity was her passion, a way to give back to the artistic community she cherished." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft but probing. "Passion can blind us, Mr. Trent, or it can sharpen our focus. One must wonder if Mrs. Hawthorne's passion was influenced by something or someone in particular." Trent's face colored slightly, his reply curt. "I cannot speculate on her motives, Miss Marple." Good day Clara's role as trustee suggested greed as a motive, her control over the fortune a tempting prize. But her nervous demeanor and apparent surprise hinted at fear rather than guilt, diverting suspicion while the true killer's intentions remained hidden. Chapter 6. Hidden Motives. The soft glow of lamplight bathed Miss Jane Marple's parlor in a warm, golden hue, a stark contrast to the chill that lingered over St. Mary's Mead in the wake of Eliza Hawthorne's murder. It was late afternoon, 2 days after the Winter Bazaar, and Miss Marple had invited the key figures in the tragedy to tea at her cottage. She had chosen the setting deliberately. Her home, with its chintz curtains and comfortable armchairs, was disarming, a place where tongues might loosen and secrets slip. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needles moving with a quiet rhythm, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, observing the subtle interplay of glances and gestures among her guests. The drawing-room was crowded, though the atmosphere was anything but festive. Lionel Hawthorne sat by the fire, his face drawn, and his fingers tapping restlessly on the arm of his chair. Clara Vane, her scarlet scarf now neatly mended, perched on the edge of a sofa, her sketchbook clutched like a shield. Mr. Percival Trent, Eliza's solicitor, stood near a bookcase, his thin frame rigid with unease, his eyes avoiding direct contact with anyone. Mrs. Agnes Reed, the constable's wife and Eliza's former housekeeper, sat stiffly beside Clara, her hands folded tightly in her lap, a silver locket gleaming at her throat. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever the enthusiastic hostess in Miss Marple's stead, bustled about with teacups, her chatter filling the awkward silences. Miss Marple had orchestrated this gathering with care, knowing that people revealed themselves most clearly when placed in close proximity to their adversaries. She poured tea with a steady hand, her voice gentle as she steered the conversation toward neutral ground. "Such a cold winter we're having," she remarked, passing a plate of scones. "It makes one appreciate a warm fire and good company." Though I fear our village has been shaken by recent events, Lionel's jaw tightened, his voice bitter. "Shaken? That's putting it mildly, Miss Marple. I'm the one they're all pointing fingers at, and I didn't do it. Aunt Eliza and I had our differences, but I'd never harm her." Clara's eyes flickered toward him, her tone sharp. "Differences? You were shouting at her the morning of the bazaar, Lionel. Everyone heard you. And now you're surprised people suspect you?" Lionel's face reddened, his hands clenching. "You're one to talk, Clara. Aunt Eliza was ready to hand you her entire fortune for your precious charity. How do we know you didn't worm your way into her trust to get it?" Clara's cup rattled in its saucer, her voice rising. "That's absurd. I never asked for anything. She chose the charity because she believed in it, not because I manipulated her." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene, but her mind alert. The accusation and counter-accusation were revealing, not for their content, but for the emotions they betrayed. Lionel's anger was raw, born of betrayal, while Clara's defensiveness suggested fear, of suspicion perhaps, or of something deeper. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Agnes Reed, who had remained silent, her fingers brushing the locket at her throat. The locket, a small but significant detail, had caught Miss Marple's eye at Hawthorne Manor, and now it seemed to pulse with unspoken meaning. Before the argument could escalate, Agnes spoke, her voice low but cutting. "You both act as if you knew her best, but Mrs. Hawthorne had her secrets. She kept things from everyone, even you, Lionel. And Clara, you weren't as close to her as you claim. I saw how she looked at you sometimes, like she was weighing you up." Clara's face paled, her fingers tightening on her sketchbook. What are you implying, Mrs. Reed? I respected Mrs. Hawthorne. She was kind to me. Agnes's lips curled slightly, a shadow of a sneer. Kind? She was kind to me too once. Gave me work when I needed it, then cast me aside when it suited her. And those letters you carried for her, don't pretend they were just about paintings. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice gentle but probing. Mrs. Reed, you mentioned those letters before. They must have been important, for Mrs. Hawthorne to entrust them to Miss Vane. Did you ever see their contents? Agnes's hand froze on her locket, her eyes darting away. No, I only saw her give them to Clara. She was always secretive, locking her study door, keeping things from the household. I was her housekeeper for years. I deserved to know more than I did. The room fell silent, the weight of Agnes's words hanging in the air. Miss Marple noted the resentment in her tone, the way her fingers clung to the locket as if it were a talisman. Before she could press further, Agnes stood abruptly, her teacup clattering as she set it down. The locket, caught by the movement, slipped from her neck and fell to the floor, springing open to reveal a photograph of a young man no older than 20, with dark hair and a solemn expression. Mrs. Bantry, quick to assist, stooped to retrieve it, but Miss Marple was faster, her small hand closing gently over the locket. She examined the photograph briefly before handing it back to Agnes, whose face had gone pale. "A handsome young man," Miss Marple said softly. "A relative, perhaps." Agnes snatched the locket, her voice tight. "It's just a keepsake. My nephew, Thomas, he passed away some years ago." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind racing. The locket was no mere keepsake. Agnes's reaction betrayed its significance. The name Thomas was new, a piece of the puzzle that did not yet fit but felt vital. She recalled a village tragedy from her youth, where a locket had held the key to a hidden relationship, its contents revealing a motive for betrayal. Was this locket a similar clue, or was it a distraction, like the scarf at the crime scene? The tea concluded with strained politeness, the guests dispersing with murmured farewells. Clara left first, her scarf trailing behind her like a scarlet flag. Lionel followed, his shoulders slumped, while Trent lingered, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something lost. Agnes was the last to go, her locket now tucked safely beneath her collar, her face a mask of composure that did not fool Miss Marple. As Mrs. Bantry helped clear the tea things, she chattered excitedly. "Did you see that, Jane?" Agnes practically threw daggers at Clara with her eyes. "And that locket, what do you make of it? I bet it's a lover, or some dark secret from her past." Miss Marple smiled faintly, stacking teacups with care. "The locket is curious, Dolly, but it is only one thread." Notice how Clara defended her relationship with Eliza, yet seemed frightened by Agnes's accusations, and Lionel's anger, genuine but tempered by something else. Guilt, perhaps, or fear of discovery. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think Lionel's hiding something? Or Clara? Oh, Jane, you're teasing me with hints. What about Mr. Trent?" "He was quiet as a mouse today." "Quiet," Miss Marple agreed, "but not unobservant. He watches Dolly, and he listens. A solicitor often knows more than he says, and Mr. Trent's unease suggests he holds a piece of this puzzle." Later that evening, Miss Marple visited Dr. Haydock, the village physician, to inquire about Eliza's health. The doctor, a gruff but kindly man, welcomed her into his study, where a fire crackled cheerfully. "Eliza was in poor health," he confided, stirring his tea. She didn't tell many, but she had a heart condition, possibly terminal. She was on medication, but it could only do so much. I suspect she knew her time was short. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. A heart condition? That might explain her urgency in changing her will. Did she mention any concerns about her family or her legacy? Dr. Haydock shook his head. Not directly, but she was preoccupied lately, always talking about making things right before it was too late. I thought it was about the charity, but perhaps there was more to it. Miss Marple thanked him and returned home, her mind weaving the new information into the tapestry. Eliza's illness added a layer of urgency to her actions, suggesting the will's change was no whim but a calculated decision. The locket, the letters, the charity, all pointed to hidden motives, personal connections that Eliza had guarded closely. Agnes's resentment, Clara's fear, Lionel's anger, and Trent's secrecy were threads that tangled together, but Miss Marple was patient. She would untangle them, stitch by stitch, until the truth emerged. "It's just a keepsake," Agnes stammered, clutching the locket as she retrieved it from the floor. "My nephew, Thomas." Nothing more. Miss Marple's smile was kind but probing. "A curious choice to carry at a bazaar, Mrs. Reed. A locket often holds more than a photograph. It holds a story." Agnes's face tightened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some stories are best left untold, Miss Marple." The locket, with its photograph of a young man, suggested a secret lover or a lost connection, diverting attention from other motives. Its significance to Agnes hinted at a personal grievance, but its true role in the murder remained elusive, casting suspicion on her while obscuring the broader web of secrets. Chapter 7. A Tangled Web. The crisp air of St. Mary's Mead carried a whisper of impending snow as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Clara Vane's cottage on Willow Lane, her steps light but determined. It was the day following her afternoon tea gathering, and the revelations from that encounter, the locket with its mysterious photograph, the simmering resentments among the suspects, had only deepened the mystery surrounding Eliza Hawthorne's murder. Miss Marple's mind, ever active, turned over the clues like a gardener sifting soil, seeking the roots beneath the surface. The locket, in particular, intrigued her. Agnes Reed's reaction to its exposure had been telling, a flash of vulnerability in an otherwise composed facade. Miss Marple suspected it held a key to the tangled web of relationships that had led to Eliza's death. Clara's cottage was a haven of artistic chaos, with canvases leaning against walls, palettes smeared with vibrant hues, and the faint scent of oil paint mingling with the aroma of fresh tea. Clara welcomed Miss Marple with a wary smile, her eyes shadowed by fatigue, as if sleep had eluded her since the bazaar. The scarlet scarf, now fully mended, hung on a hook by the door, a silent reminder of the torn fragment found at the crime scene. Miss Marple accepted a seat near the window, where light fell on a half-finished painting propped on an easel, a portrait of a young man with dark hair and solemn eyes, strikingly similar to the photograph in Agnes's locket. "What a striking portrait," Miss Marple remarked, her voice mild as she adjusted her spectacles. "The subject has such a poignant expression. A commission, perhaps?" Clara hesitated, her brush pausing mid-stroke as she worked on another canvas. "It's a personal piece. My brother Thomas, He died years ago in London. I paint him from memory to keep him close." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest, though her expression remained sympathetic. "How tragic, my dear. Losing a sibling is a profound sorrow. Did he live in St. Mary's Mead, or was his connection to the village through you?" Clara set her brush down, her hands trembling slightly. "Thomas never lived here. He was in London, struggling as an artist. He had a hard life." "But why do you ask, Miss Marple? Does this have something to do with Mrs. Hawthorne's death?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting needles emerging from her basket with a soft click. "Everything is connected in a small village like ours, Miss Vane. I noticed Mrs. Reed's locket yesterday. It held a photograph remarkably like this portrait. A coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences are rare in matters of the heart, or of murder." Clara's face paled, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Agnes? She knew Thomas. In fact, she raised him for a time, after our mother died. Thomas was my half-brother, you see. Agnes was like a foster mother to him. But it's all in the past. Thomas is gone, and Agnes, she resents me for some reason. Perhaps because I left London and didn't look back." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her needles moving steadily. The connection between Clara, Thomas, and Agnes was a thread in the web, suggesting a shared history that might explain Agnes's bitterness. But how did Eliza Hawthorne fit into this tapestry? The letters entrusted to Clara, the charity for displaced artists, Eliza's sudden will change, all pointed to a deeper link. Miss Marple recalled a family entanglement from her youth, where a hidden sibling had upended a household, leading to deceit and despair. People, she knew, carried their pasts like invisible burdens, and those burdens could twist into motives for desperate acts. Leaving Clara's cottage with more questions than answers, Miss Marple directed her steps toward Mr. Percival Trent's office in the village square. The solicitor's chambers were modest, with shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and a desk cluttered with papers. Trent greeted her with forced politeness, his thin face etched with worry, his pocket watch absent once more, a detail Miss Marple noted as a sign of his disarray. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this visit?" Trent asked, gesturing to a chair. "If it's about the will, I've already disclosed all I can." Miss Marple settled into the seat, her demeanor unassuming. "It is partly about the will, Mr. Trent, but also about Mrs. Hawthorne's affairs in general. You handled her finances, I believe. Were there any unusual transactions lately? Payments, perhaps, that seemed out of the ordinary?" Trent's eyes flickered, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "Her finances were in order. She was generous, as you know, supporting charities and such. But I cannot discuss specifics without breaching confidentiality." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but persistent. "Of course, Mr. Trent, but in light of her murder, surely some discretion can be exercised. I noticed a ledger in your office during my last visit. Perhaps you could check if there were payments to an account that might connect to our suspects." Trent hesitated, then, with a sigh, retrieved a heavy ledger from a drawer. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing lines of figures. There were regular payments to an account in London, starting about 6 months ago. Small sums at first, then larger. Mrs. Hawthorne said it was for a personal matter, but she didn't elaborate. The recipient's name isn't listed, only an account number. Miss Marple's mind raced. Anonymous payments suggested secrecy, possibly blackmail or support for someone in need. Given Clara's mention of Thomas's struggles in London and Agnes's connection to him, the payments might be linked to that shared past. "Curious," she murmured. "And did Mrs. Hawthorne mention anyone named Thomas in relation to these payments?" Trent's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering to the desk. "Thomas? How did you—" "She did mention a Thomas once, in passing. Said the payments were to honor a debt to him. But he's dead," she said. It made no sense to me. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. The payments were a tangle in the web, pointing to a debt Eliza felt toward Thomas, perhaps a familial one, given the resemblances and connections. If Thomas was Eliza's secret son, as Miss Marple was beginning to suspect, it would explain her generosity toward Clara's charity and her estrangement from Lionel. But who benefited from silencing Eliza before she could reveal more? Agnes, who had raised Thomas, Clara, his sister, or someone else who knew the secret and sought to exploit it? As Miss Marple left Trent's office, the sky darkened with gathering clouds, mirroring the complexity of the case. She decided to confront Agnes Reed directly, visiting the constable's cottage where Agnes lived with her husband. Agnes answered the door, her face wary, the locket once more at her throat. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected," Agnes said, ushering her into a neat parlor. "If it's about the murder, I've told the constable all I know." Miss Marple took a seat, her eyes on the locket. "It's about Thomas, Mrs. Reed. Clara Vane told me he was your foster son, and the portrait in her studio matches your locket. Mrs. Hawthorne's payments to a London account, were they for Thomas, or perhaps in his memory?" Agnes's hands clenched in her lap, her voice low. "Thomas was like a son to me. I raised him after his mother abandoned him. Eliza, she knew him, helped with his care sometimes. But when he died, she acted like it was nothing. Those payments? I don't know about them, but if they were for Thomas, it was too late." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Abandoned by his mother? Who was she, Mrs. Reed? And how did Eliza come to know him so well? Agnes's eyes filled with tears, her composure cracking. Eliza was his mother. She had him out of wedlock years ago and gave him to me to raise. She provided money but never acknowledged him publicly. Thomas died bitter, feeling unwanted. Clara, his half-sister, came later, but she couldn't save him. The revelation hung in the air, a crucial knot in the tangled web. Eliza's secret son explained her will's focus on artists. Thomas had been one, and her payments as belated atonement. Agnes's resentment stemmed from years of bearing the burden, while Clara's involvement was familial. But who had killed Eliza? Someone who felt betrayed by her secrecy, or who stood to gain from her death. Miss Marple thanked Agnes and departed, her mind weaving the threads. The web was tangled indeed. Eliza's hidden motherhood, Thomas's tragic death, the payments, the charity. Lionel, unaware of his cousin, had been disinherited. Trent, knowing the secret, might have exploited it. The murder at the bazaar was no random act, but the culmination of long-buried secrets. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting steadily. The clues, the locket, the portrait, the ledger, formed a pattern, but one piece was missing. She recalled a similar case of hidden parentage leading to vengeance. Patience, she thought, would untangle the web. "Thomas was dear to me," Clara said, her eyes misty as she gazed at the portrait. "But he's gone." "Why bring him up now?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, my dear. And in this village, the past has a way of shaping the present and the tragedies within it." Clara's voice trembled. "Do you think Thomas's death has something to do with Eliza's murder?" Miss Marple's tone was soft. "I think, Miss Vane, that secrets like Thomas are threads in a web, and pulling one can unravel everything. The ledger's anonymous payments suggested financial deceit or blackmail, implicating Trent as the possible recipient or facilitator. But the recipient's identity remained unclear, diverting suspicion toward him, while the true motive lay in familial betrayals. Chapter 8. Shadows of the Past. The winter sky over St. Mary's Mead hung low and heavy, its clouds promising more snow, as Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. The revelations of the previous day, Thomas as Eliza Hawthorne's secret son, Agnes Reed's role as his foster mother, and the mysterious payments in Mr. Trent's ledger had woven a complex web of motives and secrets. Yet Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a fine lace, required careful handling to reveal its full pattern. The murder of Eliza Hawthorne was no impulsive act. It was rooted in the shadows of the past, and Miss Marple was determined to illuminate them. Her morning began with a visit to the village library, a quaint building with creaking floors and shelves laden with dusty tomes. Miss Marple, under the pretense of researching local history, persuaded the librarian, Miss Emily Price, to allow her access to old records and newspapers. Miss Price, a woman with a penchant for gossip as keen as Mrs. Bantry's, was eager to assist, especially when Miss Marple mentioned Eliza's connection to Clara Vane and the late Thomas. "I heard Clara was involved in some scandal in London," Miss Price whispered, her eyes gleaming. "Something about a forged painting years ago. And Thomas, her brother, such a tragic story. He died young, didn't he? Consumption, they said, but there were rumors of other troubles." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Tragic indeed, Miss Price. Do you have any records of Thomas's time in London, or perhaps of Mrs. Hawthorne's early years? She was from the village originally, was she not?" Miss Price bustled to a stack of yellowed newspapers, pulling out editions from 2 decades prior. "Eliza was born here, yes, but she left for a time in her youth. London, I believe, before she married Mr. Hawthorne. Never spoke much about those years. As for Thomas, I'll see what I can find." The records confirmed what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. Eliza Hawthorne, then Eliza Gray, had spent several years in London in her 20s, a period shrouded in mystery. A small notice in a 1905 edition of the St. Mary's Mead Chronicle mentioned her return to the village after personal circumstances, coinciding with her marriage to the wealthy Mr. Hawthorne. Thomas's death certificate, found in a London archive Miss Price had access to, listed consumption as the cause, but a brief article hinted at a troubled life, debt, artistic struggles, and a rumored scandal involving forged artworks. Clara's name appeared in connection to the same scandal, though she had been cleared of wrongdoing. Miss Marple thanked Miss Price and returned home, her mind piecing together the fragments. Eliza's secret son, Thomas, born out of wedlock during her London years, had been raised by Agnes Reed, a loyal friend or servant at the time. Clara, Thomas's half-sister, had reconnected with Eliza later, perhaps prompting the payments and the charity in the will. But why had Eliza kept Thomas a secret, and who had resented that secrecy enough to kill her? Her next stop was Mr. Trent's office, where she hoped to probe further into the payments. Trent, however, was not alone. Constable Reed was there, examining a small silver letter opener identical to the murder weapon, found in a drawer during a search of Trent's desk. The discovery was a shock, and Trent's face was ashen as he stammered an explanation. "It's not what it seems, Constable," Trent protested, his hands raised. "I keep several such letter openers, gifts from clients. I had no idea one was used in the murder." Constable Reed's eyes narrowed. "This one's engraved with your initials, Mr. Trent, P.T., and it matches the one that killed Mrs. Hawthorne down to the floral pattern. Care to explain how it ended up at the crime scene?" Miss Marple, standing quietly in the doorway, observed the exchange. The second letter opener was a crucial clue, suggesting someone had taken it to frame Lionel, whose initials, L.H., matched the murder weapons. But Trent's involvement raised new questions. Had he lost the letter opener, or was he complicit in planting it? His nervousness, evident since the bazaar, hinted at deeper knowledge. "Mr. Trent," Miss Marple interjected, her voice mild but firm. "You mentioned payments to a London account in Mrs. Hawthorne's name. Were they to support Thomas, or perhaps to appease someone who knew of him?" Trent's eyes widened, his voice faltering. I told you it was a personal matter. She said it was a debt, but I didn't press her. I swear I had nothing to do with her death." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Mr. Trent, but secrets have a way of entangling us all. The letter opener, for instance, its presence in your desk is most curious." Constable Reed confiscated the letter opener and left, promising further investigation. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning Trent's cluttered desk, where a photograph of a younger Eliza caught her attention. It showed her in London, standing beside a young man who bore a striking resemblance to the portrait in Clara's studio. Thomas, undoubtedly. The photograph confirmed Eliza's connection to him, but it also suggested Trent had known more than he admitted. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. Thomas's existence as Eliza's son explained her payments and the charity's purpose, to honor his memory through Clara, his half-sister. Agnes's resentment stemmed from raising Thomas, while Eliza distanced herself, and the locket was her link to him. The second letter opener implicated Trent, but its discovery seemed too convenient, as if someone wanted suspicion to shift from Lionel to the solicitor. Miss Marple invited Mrs. Bantry for tea, eager to test her observations against her friend's gossip. Mrs. Bantry arrived in a flurry of excitement, her coat dusted with snow. "Jane, have you heard? They found another letter opener in Trent's office. Everyone's saying he framed Lionel to cover his own tracks. But why would he kill Eliza?" Miss Marple poured tea, her voice calm. "The letter opener is a puzzle, Dolly. It suggests someone wanted to shift blame, but Trent's fear seems genuine. Notice how he avoids discussing Thomas, yet keeps a photograph of Eliza from her London days, and Agnes's locket, Thomas's face in both her possession and Clara's studio. The past casts long shadows. Dolly, Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled. You think Thomas is the key? Was Eliza paying someone to keep quiet about him? Or was Clara blackmailing her? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Blackmail is one possibility, but I suspect it's more personal. Eliza's will was a gesture of atonement. But to whom? And who felt cheated by it? As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady companion. The shadows of the past, Thomas's birth, Eliza's secrecy, Agnes's sacrifice, Clara's loyalty, Trent's knowledge, formed a web of motives. The letter opener was a distraction, meant to mislead, but the true motive lay in the relationships Eliza had nurtured and betrayed. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth where a hidden child had sparked a murder, the culprit revealed by a single, overlooked letter. Here, too, the letters Clara carried might hold the final clue, but they remained out of reach, for now. "You knew Thomas was Eliza's son, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked Agnes softly, her eyes on the locket, during a brief encounter at the village shop later that day. Agnes's face crumpled, her voice a whisper. "She abandoned him? I gave him a home, but she never acknowledged him. When she started those payments, it was too late for Thomas." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but probing, and when she changed her will to favor Clara's charity, did that feel like another abandonment, Mrs. Reed? Agnes's eyes flashed with pain. "She owed me more than money, Miss Marple." "She owed me the truth." The second letter opener in Trent's desk pointed to his involvement, suggesting he framed Lionel to protect his own interests, but its convenient discovery hinted at another hand planting it, diverting suspicion from the true killer. Chapter 9. The Net Tightens. The village of St. Mary's Mead lay hushed under a fresh blanket of snow, its quiet beauty belying the turmoil that had gripped it since Eliza Hawthorne's murder at the Winter Bazaar. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlor with her knitting in hand, felt the threads of the mystery drawing tighter, like a scarf nearing completion. The revelations about Thomas, Eliza's secret son, raised by Agnes Reed and mourned by his half-sister Clara Vane, had cast a new light on the motives swirling around the crime. The second letter opener found in Mr. Trent's office, the torn scarf, the cigarette with red lipstick, and the cryptic note all pointed to a web of deceit, but the true pattern was only now beginning to emerge. Miss Marple knew that to catch the killer she must gather the suspects once more and lay bare the connections that bound them. She arranged a gathering at Hawthorne Manor, ostensibly to discuss the charity Eliza had endowed, but in truth to observe the suspects under pressure. The drawing-room, with its high ceilings and somber portraits, was a fitting stage for the unfolding drama. Lionel Hawthorne stood by the window, his face pale but resolute, his earlier anger tempered by a weary determination to clear his name. Clara Vane sat on a velvet chair, her mended scarlet scarf draped over her shoulders, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her sketchbook. Mr. Percival Trent, the solicitor, hovered near a sideboard, his hands fidgeting without his usual pocket watch, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an interruption. Mrs. Agnes Reed, her locket gleaming at her throat, sat with rigid composure, her gaze fixed on Clara with an intensity that spoke of old grudges. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, invited to lend an air of normalcy, chattered brightly about the weather, though her eyes sparkled with anticipation of Miss Marple's next move. Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, her voice soft, but commanding attention. "It is a sad occasion that brings us together," she said, her needles clicking steadily in her lap. "Mrs. Hawthorne's death has left many questions, and I believe we are close to answering them. Let us consider the facts. Mr. Hawthorne, you were seen arguing with your aunt the morning of the bazaar, and a letter opener bearing your initials was found in her body. Yet you claim you were at the raffle stall all evening." Lionel nodded, his voice firm. "I was, Miss Marple. I spoke with Aunt Eliza around 9, but I left her alive. I have witnesses. A vendor, Mr. Gibbs, saw me at the stall until closing. I didn't even know about the will's change until after her death." Miss Marple turned to Clara, her eyes kind but probing. "Miss Vane, a piece of your scarf was found near the crime scene, yet you say you were in your studio painting at midnight. A neighbor, Mrs. Collins, confirms seeing light in your window then. Curious, though, that the scarf was torn as if caught in haste." Clara's face flushed, her voice trembling. "I told you I must have lost it earlier at the bazaar. I wasn't near the ice sculptures after 10. Someone must have taken it, placed it there to make me look guilty." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Trent. "Mr. Trent, a second letter opener identical to the murder weapon but with your initials was found in your office. You say it was a gift, one of many, but its presence suggests someone had access to it, someone who might have used it to frame Mr. Hawthorne." Trent's hands shook as he adjusted his spectacles. "I keep such items in my desk, Miss Marple. Anyone could have taken it. I had no reason to harm Eliza. She was my client, my friend." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Agnes, her tone gentle but insistent. "Mrs. Reed, a cigarette with your distinctive red lipstick was found near the body, and you admitted to raising Thomas, Eliza's secret son. You felt she owed you for that burden, did you not? And when she changed her will to favor Clara's charity, it must have seemed a final betrayal." Agnes's fingers tightened on her locket, her voice low and bitter. "She owed me, yes. I raised her boy when she wouldn't claim him, but I didn't kill her. I was at the mulled wine stand, serving until the bazaar closed." Miss Marple paused, letting the silence press against the room's tension. "Let us consider the sequence of events," she continued. "Eliza's note, 'Meet me at midnight.' We must settle this, suggests a confrontation. Her illness, as doctor, Haydock confirmed, made her urgent to secure her legacy, likely for Thomas's memory, through Clara's charity. The payments in Mr. Trent's ledger were for Thomas, perhaps to ease Eliza's guilt. But someone resented this legacy, someone who felt cheated by her secrecy. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, leaned forward. "Jane, you're saying it's about Thomas? But he's dead. Who would kill for a dead man?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Not for him, Dolly, but for what he represented. A secret kept, a debt unpaid, a wound unhealed. Let us examine the clues. Mr. Hawthorne's alibi holds, supported by Mr. Gibbs. Miss Vane's scarf was likely planted, as her neighbor confirms her presence at home. Mr. Trent's letter opener suggests a frame, but his fear seems genuine. That leaves the cigarette, Mrs. Reed, and your connection to Thomas. Agnes's face hardened, her voice sharp. "You're accusing me, Miss Marple? I loved Thomas like my own. Eliza took him from me, then gave her fortune to Clara's charity, her way of washing her hands of him." Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice calm but piercing. "You took her money, Mrs. Reed. The ledger shows payments to you, not a London account as Mr. Trent first thought. Small sums at first, then larger after Thomas's death. Were they compensation for raising him, or something more? A price for your silence? Agnes's eyes widened, her hands trembling. She paid me to keep quiet about Thomas. She didn't want the village knowing he was her son. But when she changed her will, I saw it as a betrayal, not just of me, but of Thomas's memory. The room was silent, the weight of Agnes's admission settling over the group. Lionel stared at her, his face a mix of shock and realization. Thomas was her son. My cousin. Why didn't she tell me? Clara's voice was soft, pained. She was ashamed, Lionel. Thomas suffered for it, and so did I. The charity was her way of making amends, but it came too late. Miss Marple's gaze remained on Agnes, her mind weaving the final threads. The payments confirmed Agnes's motive, resentment deepened by Eliza's refusal to acknowledge Thomas publicly. The cigarette placed her at the scene, and her access to the manor, where she might have taken Trent's letter opener, made her a plausible suspect. Yet Miss Marple sensed one final piece was missing, a detail that would tie the net closed. She rose, her voice steady. We are close to the truth, but not there yet. The note, the scarf, the cigarette, the letter opener all point to a plan, but whose? I propose we reconvene tomorrow after I've had time to reflect. The net is tightening, and the truth will not escape. As the group dispersed, Agnes's eyes lingered on Miss Marple, a mix of fear and defiance in her gaze. Lionel and Clara exchanged a glance, their shared connection to Thomas, a new bond, however fragile. Trent slipped away quickly, his face pale. Mrs. Bantry, buzzing with excitement, whispered to Miss Marple, "Jane, you're a marvel." Agnes practically confessed. "Do you think she did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "She has revealed much, Dolly, but not all. The net is tight, but the fish has not yet been caught." That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady companion. The clues were aligning: Lionel's alibi, Clara's innocence, Trent's fear, Agnes's motive. The payments to Agnes suggested a scheme, but the murder itself felt personal, driven by emotion rather than greed. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth where a spurned confidant had turned to violence, the motive rooted in a perceived betrayal. The truth was near, but one final revelation awaited. "You took her money, Agnes," Miss Marple said calmly, her eyes steady. "But you wanted her guilt, didn't you?" To acknowledge Thomas as her own, Agnes's eyes flashed, her voice breaking. "She owed me for raising her son." She hid him away and then gave everything to Clara's charity. It was an insult to his memory. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "And that insult, Mrs. Reed, drove you to act, did it not? To confront her at midnight, where no one would see." The payments to Agnes hinted at blackmail, suggesting she killed Eliza to secure more money or silence. Her, but their true purpose, to compensate for raising Thomas, pointed to a deeper, emotional motive, keeping the killer's identity just out of reach. Chapter 10. The Shocking Truth. The grand drawing-room of Hawthorne Manor was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, its heavy drapes drawn against the snowy night outside, as if to shield the occupants from the cold reality of Eliza Hawthorne's murder. Miss Jane Marple stood at the center of the room, her small figure commanding a quiet authority that silenced the restless murmurs of the gathered suspects. Her knitting lay untouched in her basket, a rare occurrence, signaling the gravity of the moment. The net she had so carefully woven over the past days, through clues, conversations, and keen observation, had tightened, and now it was time to draw it closed. The suspect sat in a tense semicircle. Lionel Hawthorne, his face pale but resolute. Clara Vane, clutching her mended scarlet scarf. Mr. Percival Trent, his hands fidgeting without his pocket watch. And Mrs. Agnes Reed, her locket gleaming at her throat, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple with a mix of dread and defiance. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, perched on the edge of her seat, watched with bated breath, her gossip-loving heart sensing a revelation. Miss Marple's voice was calm, her tone measured, as she addressed the room. "We have come to the heart of this sad affair," she began, her eyes moving from one face to another. Mrs. Eliza Hawthorne's death at the Winter Bazaar was no random act. It was a crime born of secrets long buried, of wounds unhealed, and of a betrayal that festered in the shadows. Let us unravel the truth step by step and see where the threads lead. She paused, letting the silence underscore her words. The letter opener, engraved with Lionel's initials, pointed to him as the killer. Yet its craftsmanship was too fine for his tastes, and his alibi, confirmed by Mr. Gibbs at the raffle stall, holds firm. The scarf fragment, torn from Miss Vane's, suggested her presence at the crime scene. But her neighbor, Mrs. Collins, saw light in her studio at midnight, proving she was elsewhere. Mr. Trent's identical letter opener, found in his office, hinted at his involvement, but its discovery was too convenient, as if placed to shift suspicion from Lionel. And the cigarette, stained with Mrs. Reed's red lipstick, placed her near the body, though she claimed she was at the mulled wine stand until closing. Lionel shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. "Then who did it, Miss Marple? If not me or Clara or Trent, who?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was unwavering as it settled on Agnes Reed. "Mrs. Reed, you have carried a heavy burden for many years. You raised Thomas, Eliza's secret son, born out of wedlock in her London days. She paid you to care for him, to keep her shame hidden from the village. But when Thomas died, embittered by her refusal to acknowledge him, you felt cheated, not of money, but of justice for the boy you loved as your own." Agnes's fingers tightened on her locket, her face paling. "I told you, Miss Marple, I didn't kill her. I resented her, yes, but I was serving wine all night." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle but relentless. "So you said. But let us consider the note found near Eliza's body. Meet me at midnight. We must settle this." It was in her handwriting, urgent and personal. You, Mrs. Reed, had access to Hawthorne Manor, where you once worked. You could have taken Mr. Trent's letter opener, knowing its twin bore Lionel's initials, to cast suspicion on him. The scarf fragment, easily torn from Clara's during a visit to her cottage, was planted to muddy the waters. And the cigarette, yours unmistakably, places you at the scene, not serving wine as you claimed. Clara's voice trembled as she spoke. "Agnes, is this true? Did you frame me? Why?" Agnes's eyes flashed with pain, her voice breaking. "You don't understand, Clara. Eliza abandoned Thomas, left me to raise him while she lived in her grand manor. Then she gave her fortune to your charity, as if that could erase what she did to him. I couldn't bear it." Miss Marple's tone grew firmer, her eyes piercing. You confronted Eliza at midnight, didn't you? You met her by the ice sculptures, where the bazaar's noise would mask your voices. You demanded she acknowledge Thomas publicly to honor his memory. But she refused, perhaps fearing scandal or simply unable to face her past. In a moment of rage, you stabbed her with the letter opener you'd taken from Trent's desk, planting the scarf to implicate Clara and trusting the initials would point to Lionel. The room was deathly silent, all eyes on Agnes, her composure shattered, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the locket. She wouldn't listen, she sobbed. I begged her to tell the truth about Thomas, to give him the respect he deserved. But she said it was too late, that the charity was enough. It wasn't enough. I didn't mean to kill her. It just happened. Miss Marple's voice softened, tinged with sorrow. But there is more, Mrs. Reed, is there not? The payments in Mr. Trent's ledger were to you, not a London account. Eliza paid you for years, not just for Thomas's care, but to ensure your silence. Yet you grew greedy, didn't you? You began poisoning her slowly, using her heart medication to weaken her, hoping to hasten her death before the will could take effect. But when you learned she had changed it to favor Clara's charity, your impatience led to murder. Agnes's sob turned to a gasp, her eyes wide with shock. How did you know about the poison? Miss Marple's expression was grave. Dr. Haydock mentioned Eliza's heart condition, but her symptoms, fatigue, irregular pulse, suggested more than natural decline. I consulted him this morning, and he confirmed traces of an overdose in her system, consistent with her medication. You had access to her household, Mrs. Reed, and the knowledge to tamper with her. Pills. The stabbing was a desperate act when your slower plan failed. Lionel's voice was hoarse with disbelief. Poison? Agnes, you meant to kill her all along? Agnes collapsed into her chair, her hands covering her face. I wanted her to suffer as Thomas did. I thought the poison would be untraceable, but when she changed the will, I panicked. I couldn't let her erase him completely, Constable Reed, summoned earlier by Miss Marple, stepped into the room, his face grim. Mrs. Reed, you'll need to come with me. You're under arrest for the murder of Eliza Hawthorne. As Agnes was led away, her locket glinting in the lamplight, the room seemed to exhale. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her voice soft. Thomas would have hated this. All I wanted was to honor him with the charity. Lionel, his face a mix of relief and sorrow, nodded. I didn't know about Thomas, Clara. If I had, I'd have understood her better. Mr. Trent, silent until now, spoke quietly. I suspected the payments were to Agnes, but Eliza swore me to secrecy. I never imagined it would come to this, Mrs. Bantry. Her eyes wide, clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, you're a genius. Poison and a stabbing. It's like something out of a novel. Miss Marple's smile was faint, tinged with sadness. Vengeance, Dolly, is a poor substitute for love. Agnes loved Thomas, but her love turned to bitterness, and that bitterness consumed her. The gathering dispersed, the truth laid bare. Lionel inherited a portion of the estate, as the will allowed, and Clara's charity thrived, a tribute to Thomas's memory. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her knitting resumed, the village's peace restored, for now. As she sat by her fire, she reflected on the shadows of the past, how they lingered and twisted lives. The truth had been shocking, but it was the human heart, with its capacity for love and rage, that had woven this tragedy. You took everything from him, Agnes sobbed, her voice breaking as she faced Miss Marple. Eliza abandoned Thomas, and I couldn't let her erase him again with that charity. Miss Marple sighed, her voice gentle but firm. Vengeance, Agnes, is a poor substitute for love. You killed her to right a wrong, but you only deepened the tragedy. Agnes's tears fell freely. I just wanted her to feel what he felt, alone, unwanted. Agnes was arrested, her confession sealing her guilt in both the poisoning and the stabbing. Lionel and Clara found a tentative peace, united by their shared loss. The village, shaken but resilient, moved forward, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, returned to her quiet life, knowing that secrets, like snow, could cover but never erase the truth.